Imagine a democracy built on corruption. Imagine the results of elections being decided before a vote is cast. Not because there is only one party or the results are invented, but because thousands of local bosses coerce, bribe, and intimidate millions of voters into obediently voting this way or that depending on the whim of the elite. Imagine a country where reformers who pledge to sweep away corruption bribe their way into office, where men who make a stand for change are bought off with cabinet seats. A country where the king chooses his favorites for the premiership, and where the army is a law unto itself. The system you have just imagined was history's worst democracy. Hello and welcome to episode 6 of History's Most. Today, history's worst democracy.
That's right. I'm Alex and that was Peter. And Happy New Year to everyone, first of all.
Happy New Year.
Yeah. What a way to start the new year than by looking at the worst democracy history's ever seen.
We're off to a good start.
Absolutely.
So what is the worst democracy that the world has ever seen?
Well, we are going to say that it is Spain in the early 20th century, specifically 1876 through to 1923, a period known as the Restoration era, or sometimes called the Liberal Monarchy, where Spain had a democracy that was a democracy in, let's say, name only.
Yeah. It's kind of difficult to explain how exactly it's a democracy, but technically it is.
Yeah. It was a monarchy in that it had a king at the top, but it was supposed to be a constitutional monarchy in the style of, say, a Great Britain. But there was various things that the ruling class did that made sure that this was not a true democracy. I mean, this was an era, kind of late 19th, early 20th century, where there was loads of different systems around the world to kind of control democracy, if you like. In Germany, for example, there was a system of voting which put a different weight depending on your class to your vote. In the Kaiser's Germany. In Britain, voting was tied to kind of being a householder. So, although in some countries like France there was genuine kind of universal male suffrage, we should say, and of course the United States, that wasn't the case everywhere. So democracy had a much more loose meaning, I guess, than it does now.
And in Spain, what was Spain's unique system of democracy?
Well, it was the product of kind of how backward and crisis-ridden Spain was in the 19th century. There had been a series of kind of internal conflicts and civil wars, known as the Carlist Wars. There had been dozens of military coups over the course of the 19th century. They had even had a go at having a republic in the 1870s, and that went disastrously wrong. So, in 1876, a guy called Antonio Canovas created a new constitution, a new system, which would be a constitutional monarchy with a Cortes, a parliament, elected, and soon it was universal male suffrage, all men could vote. But how can the ruling class make sure that if everyone can vote, they don't choose the wrong party? Well, the system that he created, sometimes called the Canovite system, relied on a number of things. First of all, it relied on the apathy and lack of education of most Spaniards. But there was a system or a kind of understanding known as the Turno Pacifico, the peaceful turnover or transition or rotation. Because what Canavas did, he was a conservative, you're probably not surprised to hear, but he helped his political enemy, a guy called Sagasta, to set up a rival Liberal Party. But because they were kind of cooperating and because Canavas had helped set up the Liberal Party to be his rival, they kind of worked out a system, they agreed a system with each other, which would be that they would simply alternate in office. Every 3, 4, 5 years, they'd just switch over.
Right.
The Turno Pacifico, in a way, that's how democracy works, but they would just arrange it of, once you've had your go, we'll have ours.
This, I assume, allows for no third parties whatsoever to have any power.
Well, it does raise the question, how do you make sure that the people vote the way that you want them to, right? If you've agreed that in 5 years you're going to let the Liberal Party come in, well, how do you know that they're going to vote in an election for the Liberal Party?
I think I am beginning to smell the beginnings of electoral fraud here.
Right. So Spain was quite a backwards and in many ways quite a corrupt country. To give you a kind of illustration, I'm going to fire at you some statistics.
Right.
So way back in 1788, the census that was done showed that 50% of adult males did not do any productive work whatsoever.
Right.
And they were members of the church, the army, or the nobility. Who obviously didn't have a job. So you had this huge divide in Spain between what they said, those who worked and those who didn't. And the church, the landowners, the nobility, and the army were kind of the trinity that held power, if you like, to the exclusion kind of everybody else. Now, this meant that Spain kind of entered the 20th century, the late 19th century, way behind other kind of Western and European countries. It hadn't experienced really the Industrial Revolution, like the rest of Europe and America, of course, had. Poverty was so bad that you had millions of people in that time period emigrating to America, North and South, primarily. Life expectancy was 35.
Wow.
Which is the same as it had been in the kind of golden age of Spain in the 1600s. 64% of the population estimated were illiterate. Couldn't read or write. Only about 18% of the population were employed in what we would recognise as industrial kind of work. So most people were farming the land. An awful lot of them were illiterate. Obviously, the church controlled education and had quite a big say over kind of how the country was run. And one thing that I never forget, one of those historical facts that always stays with you, if you went around, particularly southern Spain, which was the poorest and most underdeveloped, you would, in the early 20th century, have still been able to find Roman coins in circulation.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Spain, as a state, hadn't really moved out of the medieval period. In the roles that it did, the church, like I say, was providing education. Yeah. There was no kind of social security. There was no income tax in Spain until 1977. So, the state didn't really play much of the role that it began to play in the 19th century in most Western nations. But, of course, that meant it was much easier for corruption to prosper when the kind of tentacles of state power were not quite so kind of deep-rooted into life. So
Yeah.
to go back, I guess, to our question of how did they make sure the right party won, the answer, quite simply, the thing that makes this the worst democracy is corruption on a scale that is hard to imagine being called a democracy.
It's just unprecedented.
So basically the results of the election were decided before the election at the Ministry of the Interior, because it would be worked out between the king and the two parties who would win this time. But how do you then get the results? Basically, in each locality, there would be someone known as a cacique, a term that kind of means like a local boss. They could be the landowner, they could be the employer, they could be like the mayor of the village or the town. And how do you make sure that your people in your town or who live on your land vote the way that you are ordered to? Well, you do it through a mixture of kind of coercion, threats, bribery, and that way you get the people who are effectively under you to vote the way that you want them to this time round.
What a democracy.
Yeah. So let's say you're a peasant farming the land in southern Spain. The landowner, it's election time, the landowner says vote Conservative or else we'll evict you from your farm. Or the only employer of any note in the region says, vote this way or you'll lose your job.
Yeah.
And of course, if that wasn't going to work, these local strongmen would often have basically just gangs of thugs that would intimidate and threaten and make sure you voted the right way. And on top of that, I believe there was also glass kind of voting boxes.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't a secret ballot. So all these threats you would be intimidated by them because you couldn't just go into the voting booth and it's you and the pen.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you had large-scale electoral fraud in terms of, gerrymandering of constituencies, just replacing votes.
Yeah.
All of these mechanisms together meant that this Turno Pacifico, for a while, functioned perfectly. And after a few years of a Conservative government, the Liberals would come to power. And it would just rotate like this. And the elections were simply there to provide a kind of veneer of legitimacy.
Yeah. Let me ask, in terms of the regions of Spain, because when you're talking about Spain, each region is so different from each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was there any particular region that this was happening more in, this fraud or this intimidation and coercion than others, say?
Yeah, like I said, southern Spain was the kind of least developed. But as I've kind of set out, Spain was a predominantly rural country.
Right.
So this could be done over a large kind of part of the country. The big cities, Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, Valencia, it was a lot harder to do that, you can imagine, to kind of carry out that kind of subtle coercion. So in the cities, they would sometimes turn up candidates for, other parties, like there was Republican parties who wanted to get rid of the monarchy, socialist parties. But ultimately, because the majority of the country was rural,
it gets outweighed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the results would reflect basically what the Ministry of Interior had dictated. Interestingly, you talk about regions, though. Spain, it's been reflected in recent years as well, hasn't it, as a country with strong regional tendencies.
Oh, yeah.
And one region in particular was feeling kind of by the turn of the 20th century, this system wasn't working for them. And that was Catalonia, because Catalonia had developed industrially, unlike most of Spain, and was pretty prosperous. But then in 1898, you had the Spanish-American War, which just highlighted how weak and corrupt Spain was because they got absolutely trounced
Yeah.
by the Americans, who they would have seen as like a junior power after all, because Spain had been the first real colonial power. But that was such a catastrophe, not just because of their defeat, but because they lost basically their entire colonial empire.
Yeah. It was a
Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Cuba. The Americans kind of took the lot. Still got, of course, Puerto Rico, haven't they?
Yeah. I mean, it was a real wake up call for the Spanish upon losing the Spanish-American War, and I know that going into it, a lot of the decision making was based in we have to put up an effort. We can't just we can't just not fight.
Yeah, it was laughable, to be honest, the Spanish effort in that war. You had officers who were so corrupt they'd sold all the supplies and equipment that they were supposed to give their troops. And you had a situation where, the soldiers out in Cuba were just starving, and so therefore in no condition to fight. And it did, like you say, it was a wake-up call. Hello, the 20th century's knocking, and you're not a great power anymore. You're a poor European nation. And it was a moment of shock that inspired the Catalans in particular to think this system isn't working, because Cuba had been the main market for Catalan industry, and they lost it.
Yeah. So there goes their exports, and there goes their economy.
Their prosperity. Yeah. And they began to think, why are we listening to this corrupt political class who aren't even representing our interests?
So what did the Catalonians do to kind of throw off the shackles of this corrupt system?
Well, all Spaniards were reflecting that something has to change. So there began to be this movement for regeneration. The Catalans began to support a party called the Liga, headed by a successful businessman called Francesc Cambó. And they really started to dominate elections in Catalonia. So the Turno wasn't working there. The two main Turno parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, both proclaimed that they were going to regenerate Spain. There was going to be a revolution from above. And you had this guy, became leader of the Conservative Party, called Antonio Maura. Considered himself a bit of a strong man, a guy who was going to remold Spain as a kind of modern nation and sweep away the corruption. When he was elected in 1907, it was one of the dirtiest elections on record, even in Spain.
Not off to a good start.
Exactly. So he tried to reform local government, because local government, as you can imagine with the caciques, was the most corrupt. The trouble is his bill basically got swamped by amendments and filibustering because, of course, did the political class want to give up their position?
Yeah.
Did they want to reform the very system that was ensuring they got elected every time? No. And not only that, but he had absolutely no cooperation from the Liberals, because he insisted that, the true Spaniard was a conservative. So if actually Spaniards' real opinions counted in elections, they'd always vote conservative. And also he introduced a law, anti-terror law, which Spain had problems with anarchists and anarchist terrorism around this time. So this law was saying that you could basically shut down newspapers, clamp down on kind of civil liberties, and the Liberal Party said that's violating the Constitution, it's against civil rights. So his project at reforming Spain very quickly hit the buffers. And he personally was ousted because in 1909, fighting broke out in Morocco. And why does that matter to a Spaniard? Well, because Spain controlled northern Morocco. It was the last kind of part of their empire left.
Yeah.
And the native population began to rebel and fight back against their kind of colonial overlords. And so Maura began to call conscripts to go over to Morocco to fight. But this was a really divisive issue in Spain because, and I'm reminded of a certain current president, in Spain you could buy out of conscription. So if you paid a certain amount of money, you were not conscripted. So rich people in the middle class didn't have to go. Again, another aspect of corruption.
Wow. I'm reminded of Creedence Clearwater Revival's "Fortunate Son."
Yeah, very much so. And to be honest, I would not like to be in Morocco in the 1910s and 20s, almost more than I wouldn't want to be in Iraq in Vietnam in the 60s.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't fancy being in Iraq right now either. But to get back to the point, what happened was in Barcelona there was this uprising, basically just rioting, called Tragic Week, where the populace expressed their anger, primarily triggered by this conscription issue about, basically poor young men having to go and fight for what it was seen as the interests of the king and the rich, because the only real benefit of this part of northern Morocco, it wasn't particularly prosperous, was that it had mineral mines, which Spanish kind of business liked the look of. And the government clamped down and crushed this tragic week of violence in Barcelona and executed an anarchist school teacher who'd had nothing to do with it. But there was an international outcry and Maura was forced from office, and he was very bitter because, of course, the Turno meant that the Liberals came in and the Liberals kind of undid everything he was trying to do.
Yeah. So
he basically said the Liberals aren't fit to govern and began railing against the Turno because he basically thought only he was fit to govern. A fellow politician of him once said with Maura, his only kind of political belief is you're either for Maura or against Maura.
Less democratic than I would expect from a democracy.
Yeah, not exactly a statesman who's going to unite the country.
Yeah. So the Liberal Party's taken over. What kind of ideas do they have to reform the country? Because obviously it hasn't worked with the Conservatives.
Yeah, so a guy called Jose Canalejas becomes Prime Minister, and he's the kind of strongman of the Liberal Party. If you've got Maura as the strongman of the Conservatives, Canalejas is going to have a go at regenerating Spain, but from a liberal point of view. So he kind of attacks church control over education. He tries to improve the taxation system so that it's kind of more fair, more progressive. One of the problems Spain has at this time is, like I said, there was no income tax, so the state didn't have much money. So the rich and middle class just weren't used to being taxed very much. Which meant that, a lot of these projects, there just wasn't the money to do it. He gave a degree of self-government to Catalonia, gave them a kind of regional administration, which kind of temporarily settled things down there. He also got rid of what I just said about how the rich could buy their way out of military service.
Well, that's good.
So you'd think, some progress being made here.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he increased the commitment to Morocco. If anything, the kind of Liberal Party members were more financially interested in Morocco. And after a series of strikes in 1911, he basically sent in the army to crush the workers. So he ends up getting assassinated by an anarchist in 1912.
Right.
So that attempt at reform also ends in kind of disaster.
So does the Turno come in, and are the Conservatives now back in?
Right. Now, this is where the king sticks his nose in, a guy called Alfonso XIII. Not very imaginative with their names, almost as bad as France with their Louis. So what Alfonso does, instead of appointing the successor as just the leader of the Liberal Party, a guy called Garcia Prieto, he picks another member of the Liberal Party, one of his personal favourites, someone who'd been his advisor in the past, a guy called Count Romanones, which is very hard to pronounce in English. It's Roman and then Wands, basically, if you want to look him up, because he is one of the most kind of corrupt and risible characters of this whole corrupt and risible system. But that only serves to split the Liberal Party. So the Liberal Party is divided into factions who support Romanones and who support Garcia Prieto. So it was a very irresponsible act by the king. And then after a couple of years of Romanones, who is basically just a creature of the system, he doesn't have any particular ideas or beliefs himself, the Turno comes again. So they go to Maura, but Maura says, no, this system is corrupt. I don't agree with the whole Turno. I hate the Liberal Party. I refuse to take part in this facade. And what happens? Well, another Conservative called Eduardo Dato accepts the offer of being Prime Minister.
Okay, so nothing really happens.
And Maura is shocked and appalled when his own party is happy to resume the benefits of high office and being in government. And he basically kind of throws his toys out the pram and creates a movement called the Maristas. Like I said, all he believes in really is himself. Who rile against the corruption of the system, but at the end of the day, the system kind of cranks on. But the Turno parties, what's important is by the time we're kind of almost at the start of the First World War, the Turno parties themselves are breaking apart. You know, the Conservatives split with Maura, the Liberals split, as I just explained. So this system, the wheels are beginning to come off.
And I'm going to assume that World War I is really one of the moments, one of the watershed moments where this system starts to really fall apart.
Yeah, World War I puts paid to a whole load of political systems and empires around Europe, and indirectly it does so into this, this system in Spain, this worst democracy.
In spite of Spain being neutral in World War I, the effects from all these other empires, falling or being affected in one way or another has a direct knock-on effect on Spain, as well as the economy, of course.
Yeah, it's funny because at first Spain does very well out of World War I. Because she stays neutral. It means that she experiences an economic boom. She can sell to both sides because both sides suddenly need stuff. They need weapons, obviously, but they also need food. They need uniforms. They need bandages. Demand suddenly massively increases, and the industries in France, Britain, whatever, switch over to war production. So it leaves a gap in the market that Spain can fulfill in terms of both agricultural and industrial products. So Spain, particularly businessmen, industrialists, make a lot of money very quickly. But as a result, prices rise really rapidly because there's a lot of foreign money coming into Spain. Spain's getting very rich, so prices are rising. But as prices rise, they're rising more rapidly than wages. So the living standard of the ordinary Spaniard is actually declining. Because of this, the kind of worker movements that we haven't mentioned so far, excluded from this democracy, which were the socialists and the anarchists. They begin to grow in strength and popularity. And the king realizes he's got to do something about it. So there's another turn of the Turno. This kind of revolving door spins again. And in 1915, Romananes is back. Right. And he has, as his Minister of Finance, a guy who's considered a bit of a rising star in the Liberal Party, a young, kind of bright young thing of the future called Santiago Alba. And Alba is thinking, right, we're making all this money. We should use it to rebuild the country, to bring it kicking and streaming probably into the 19th century, to be fair. But into the 20th century. And the key part of that was a war profits tax. Right? So who's making all the money? The industrialists. Let's tax the profits they're making and pay for a kind of national reconstruction. Finally, we can start to do the kind of reform and build the infrastructure and kind of bring this country into the modern era. I mentioned the Liga, the Catalan League, a little while ago. Now, they kind of felt like the government in Madrid didn't look after their interests. So what do you think their reaction would be to a proposal to tax all the profits they're making?
Well, I would assume they wouldn't be very happy about it.
Exactly.
You've never cared about us before, and now you want to tax us. Okay.
And because the Liga had been quite successful in elections in Catalonia, they had, and because of the divisions in the Turno parties, they basically had the deciding say in Parliament.
Right.
They had the crucial votes in the Cortes that Alba needed for his plan. So his plan, his budget, failed to pass in early 1917. The Liga had basically broken the Turno system and kind of invaded it. And all of this was partly brought about by none other than Count Romananes, who quite deliberately sabotaged the plan for national reconstruction because he thought Alba would get too much prestige from it.
Wow.
Exactly.
I mean, it's so bizarre to think about this. I mean, here you have an opportunity to bring this country into the 20th century, and there's just so many things that go wrong with it. Wow.
It's it's the worst democracy because no one can see the obvious,
the real problem. Like there's I
know obviously hindsight's 20/20, but no one seems to, at least none of the kind of key figures at the top, seems to ever think, maybe our actions are to blame to some extent here. Whether it's the king interfering in the Turno and messing up the party system, whether it's Maura claiming to be a great reformer but really probably interested in himself, whether it's the same for Romananes. It's just a mess of short-sightedness, politically speaking.
They just, that's probably the best way of putting it. It's just they can't see the big picture.
And it gets worse, of course, because it's an episode of History's Most, so it's got to get worse.
It always has to get worse.
1917 is a terrible year for Spain. Like I mentioned, there's galloping inflation, so prices are going up and living standards are falling. So workers are unhappy. The kind of middle-class business elite are unhappy because the government isn't looking after them, proposing war profits and that. And what's the only thing really keeping a lid on things? It's the army. And the army begins to get a bit unhappy. Or more specifically, a part of the army. So you have army officers, and they're beginning to get divided between those of them who are based in Spain, whose promotion is based on seniority. So after 10 years service, you get promoted. After 20 years service, you get promoted, whatever. And then there's all these so-called Africanistas, which are officers gallivanting off fighting in Morocco, being very brave, slaughtering civilians, that sort of thing. And they're getting promoted by merit, by bravery on the battlefield, by becoming like the king's favourites, that sort of thing.
Right.
Now, most officers, because of the wartime inflation, promotion is obviously linked to pay. And so for a lot of officers in the Spanish army based in Spain, they are seeing their living standards drop dramatically. Many of them have to take on like a second job to support their families.
Wow.
So army officers begin to form what's known as juntas. They were basically almost like a trade union for army officers. And they demand, better pay, fairer promotions. But they also couch these appeals, at least to the press, in kind of regenerationist terms, saying, Spain is corrupt, the government doesn't listen, we need to change things. And of course that hit a chord, struck a chord with most Spaniards.
Yeah.
So these kind of almost military protesters, rather than being seen as traitors, are seen as kind of heroes who are standing up to this corrupt government. And in June of 1917, the government eventually... so they begin to arrest the leaders of these juntas, but of course the army doesn't take very well to that. And they're basically pressured by the army high command and the king to let them go. Now, if you take away the army, what's left keeping this system afloat?
I don't know.
Not very much.
Yeah.
Which is why a lot of people see this as the chance that to reform Spain, sweep away the old system. The Liberal government, you'll not be surprised to hear, falls because of the junta crisis. So Eduardo Dato is brought back in. Conservatives, Turno, revolving door, they're back. And he's faced with a pretty severe crisis because the army is clearly discontented. The Liga, the Catalans, led by Cambo, are obviously unhappy and are beginning to call for a new system, basically a proper democracy, in that they're joined by kind of middle-class liberals and also the kind of workers' movement, the socialists. And Cambo's Liga calls a kind of alternative parliament, kind of becomes known as the Assembly Movement, and they all meet in Barcelona in July 1917. There's socialists, there's Republicans, there's the Liga. Basically, everyone who thinks Spain should be a proper democracy all comes together, and it's like, oh, this is like a proper challenge. Yeah. They're calling for clean elections. They're calling for a new constitution. And they think, because of the junta movement, that they might well also get an army on. And this is where Eduardo Dato, the Prime Minister, steps in. He has been described as a man of Vaseline.
Okay.
A slippery character.
Yeah.
Like his counterpart in the Liberal Party, Roman Anez, he's very much a creature of this system. He's not going to listen to any ideas for reform, but he's a lot more kind of flexible and sly than a Maurer. A Maurer is a kind of brute force kind of politician. Dato shows that he knows how to use divide and rule. So what he does is he shuts down the parliament, the Cortes, he suspends the constitution, and he introduces censorship, to the point where there's some reports in the pro-government press that the Cambo's assembly didn't even happen.
Okay, right.
Just deny it.
Just deny it, yeah. Okay.
And then he moves swiftly and cleverly. He just agrees to all the junta's demands. about pay, promotion, even lets them pick who's going to be the war minister in his government.
That's quite a large secession of power. All right.
Right. So, yeah, another problem is with this democracy is the army is getting more and more powerful, right?
Yeah.
He then has to... He's still got against him the kind of middle-class reformers, of whom Cambo and the League are the kind of front men, and the workers' movement, the socialists. At the minute, those two are allied together in the assembly movement. He's got to try and break them apart. So again, he's really clever. There's an issue in the city of Valencia, a kind of dispute between the railway workers and the company. It looks like it might spiral into a strike. So even though the socialists were desperate to avoid a strike, the government kind of steps in, declares it a national emergency, declares the railways this kind of national asset that needs to be protected, and basically puts down the demands the socialist trade union, which is either unconditional surrender or you go on strike. So they turn it into, deliberately provoke it into a much bigger issue than it had been, that tempts the socialists into calling a general strike, trying to overthrow the government, basically.
Ah, right.
So the socialists call a general strike in August of 1917. But of course, they were hoping that the middle class, led by Cambo, that the army juntas would support them. And did they? Of course they didn't.
They were wrong.
The army, of course, has just been paid off, so they crushed the strike with not a little violence, a few hundred deaths. And of course, it frightens the middle class and the business owners. You know, a general strike, particularly in 1917, when a few months before you'd had the Russian Revolution, it frightens the middle class into basically abandoning the socialists. So Dato has he's brought the army on side, destroyed the threat from the socialists, and scared the middle class away from any ideas of reform. It's democracy at its worst, really, at its most divide and rule, its most cynical, if you like. And then he gets a bit cocky, gets a bit arrogant. A few months later, in October, the army intercept a secret message, which was the government basically preparing to crush the juntas. So the army hand an ultimatum to the king, saying, basically, appoint a new government within 72 hours, or we will.
Wow, it's escalated very quickly.
Yeah. So, what does the king do? He brings in both the liberals and the conservatives, but also the Liga. The juntas were bought off with money. The Liga are bought off with cabinet seats, positions of power. So the Catalan Liga are brought into the government as well, and a kind of government of national concentration, bringing together all the parties, all the biggest parties, is formed.
So they've assembled this new government, and they've appeased the juntas. They've pretty much sorted it out, right? Is it back to normal? Is it good?
Are we back to the lovely peaceful Turno?
Yeah.
Where only the elites have power? The answer is no. The events of the last few years have basically broken the system, because after all the upheaval of 1917, there's elections called for February 1918 to try and settle things down. The trouble is, the Turno parties have become so fragmented by all these crises. So the Dato's Conservatives win the election. They get 98 seats, but you need 205 seats for a majority. I'll just reel off some of the other results to show you why. Next up, you've got a group called the Liberal Democrats, which is a splinter Liberal Party group led by Garcia Prieto, kind of originating from what I mentioned before, where the king picked his own guy instead of the actual liberal leader. Then you've got the Liberal Party under Romananez. Then you've got the Maristas, led by Maura, obviously, rebel conservatives. Then you've got the Liberal Left, which is another rebel liberal group led by Santiago Alba. Obviously, he didn't want anything to do with Romananez anymore.
Yeah.
Then you've got the Liga. Then you've got another rebel group, basically a hardline group that took the army line, the junta line. And then you've got the kind of unofficial, the parties that aren't part of the system, still winning seats like Republicans and Socialists.
Mm.
So it's an absolute mess. And it's impossible for any party to form a majority in the Cortes and to govern. The system is kind of breaking down.
Yeah.
If nothing else, because these elites can't even agree with each other anymore. You know, the idea of this peaceful handover just isn't working anymore. So the king calls together all these groups and insists that they all work together in what's termed at the time the Cabinet of Titans.
Right.
Or they're sometimes translated also as the Cabinet of Giants. You know, it sounds like a
League of Nations type thing.
It's Avengers Assemble.
Yeah.
It's bringing together the kind of all the top people from each of these various factions within the Turno system. So you've got Maura is brought back to be a prime minister, tough guy for a tough situation. But also you've got Dato, Romananez, Garcia Prieto, Cambo, Alba, all of them in the government.
This is sounding more like an oligarchy more than a democracy, to be honest. All ruled over by a king as well.
Yeah. A king who, you know, unlike, say, in the UK, is playing a fairly active role.
Yeah. It's, How is this a democracy?
Well, yeah, just every party that we like gets to be in the government. What do you reckon the chances are for this Cabinet of Titans, then?
Oh, it's going to be a mess, isn't it? I mean, there's so many clashing visions here. No one's going to get along.
I think even more important than the visions is that, you know, you've got Maura and Dato in the same cabinet.
Yeah.
Who, obviously, Dato betrayed Maura to get to be prime minister. You've got Romananez and Alba, and again, Romananez betrayed Alba. You know,
everybody hates each other. There's no way this can work.
Cambo, who last year had been saying we need to get rid of this system, it's corrupt, and now he's in it as I think he was Minister of Finance. It lasts from March till November 1918.
Wow.
It basically breaks down because in the Parliament, in the Cortes, they're just arguing with each other from the benches. Not even with the opposition.
Oh my. Wow.
And that's really the Turno system, as it was supposed to function, is over. And you just get this period of instability of governments because, like I was reeling off all those factions, no one faction, even with the corruption, no one of those factions can win because the Conservative and Liberal parties are split into three groups each. You know, you can't fix an election to ensure that three factions of the Conservative Party get enough seats. And on top of that, you've had a lot of rural to urban migration during the First World War because of the industrial boom. And again, that makes it harder to fix the elections. So you get this situation where over the next few years, from 1918 through to 1923, when this system, by the way, spoilers, finally dies, there are 12 different governments, 12 changes of prime minister.
Right.
What's that? Just over 5 years, 6 years?
Yeah, about 5 years, yeah.
So that's like at least 2 governments a year, on average.
That's not workable, is it?
Even this kind of... We've gone from a corrupt system that at least kind of worked. You had the Turno of switching between the two parties to a system that just isn't working anymore. I mean, it's like always cited, like, say, the Weimar Republic as being super unstable democracy. And I think, I might be getting the figure slightly wrong, but I think they had 14 governments in the Weimar Republic, which lasted about 15 years, the Weimar.
Yeah.
Just under. Which is held up as like, look how unstable it was. You know, they had 13 or 14 governments in as many years. Well, the Spanish are outdoing them. 12 in 5 or 6 is just unsustainable.
Yeah, and so what do they do to fix this?
Well, unsurprisingly, you have basically the country fall into a bit of a state of chaos.
Yeah.
You have obviously the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which I think we mentioned way back in episode 1, really does inspire a lot of the left to be like, this is our moment. Yeah. So the anarchist movement in Spain, which, by the way, is the kind of history's only example of a really powerful and popular anarchist movement. They had about 1 million members at this point. They are very militant at this time. There's kind of a lot of strikes and mini uprisings by anarchists. Partly it's because once the First World War ends, the prosperity that Spain had been enjoying obviously ends too.
Yeah.
You know, they've made all their money selling stuff to the warring powers. Well, hang on. That market disappears overnight.
Yeah.
So suddenly, you know, workers' living standards, which already have been squeezed, worse. The government agreed to a whole load of demands over the course of this time period, like, say, the 8-hour day, which was kind of a basic trade union demand. But because the government's so weak and constantly changing, the bosses, the employers, just ignore it. They don't. It's not enforced by the government. So, you know, these higher wages, shorter working hours just get ignored. So the workers become more militant because, you know, they're not getting what they've been promised. Yeah. And you get something, it's sometimes called the Bolshevik Triennial, which is a bit of an overstatement, but it's basically 3 years of worker unrest, basically.
Right.
During that time period, just under 1,000 people are killed in 3 years of violence between workers and employers. So you get a situation where both these anarchists and also the bosses and the bosses' unions hire gunmen, you know, employ dirty tricks. It's basically just a social war almost. It's a conflict between class interests that's kind of spirals out of control. The most high-profile victim is actually Dato himself, who was assassinated in 1921 by an anarchist. So at home, the situation is really rough. You know, the economy is not great, and there's a lot of unrest. Yeah. And things are even worse abroad.
So what's going on abroad then?
Yeah, so this long colonial war in Morocco is still going on. The Moroccan rebels, led by a guy called Abd al-Krim, are really kind of tough fighters. It's a guerrilla war, and it's therefore quite, you know, conventional armies always fight a guerrilla war.
Yeah.
Spanish army in particular, as we've kind of seen from Spanish-American War, is very backwards and not, you know, very well equipped. So it's really tough, and it's a really brutal conflict with, you know, lots of kind of killing of prisoners, civilians, use of, you know, kind of poison gas, mutilation of the kind of opposition's corpses.
Jesus.
It's really, really a messy, bloody and unpleasant colonial war.
Yeah.
And with the lack of direction from Madrid, the army in Morocco is kind of its own entity. I mean, the army's power, as we've seen, is already growing, but they basically just run Morocco for themselves and have the full say over that colony. they're answerable really at this point only to the king, not to the government. And in a kind of, yet again, an overwhelming example, the Spanish army comes in for a horrific defeat at something called the Annual Disaster in 1921. Basically, a guy called General Silvestre marches out with a column of something like 10,000 troops to try and face down these, rebels, track down the guerrillas.
Yeah.
And in this, he is apparently, it's widely considered, although the telegram has never been found, he received, encouraged by the king, who sent him a telegram, this General Silvestre, saying, "Ole, boys, I'm waiting for the 25th. This was on the 21st of July, the 25th being St. James's Day, who's the patron saint of Spain, and the patron saint also of the Spanish army. So the accusation is the king wanted a victory for the holy day to celebrate. And so he sent this telegram encouraging recklessly the army to march out and crush the rebels. But of course, what happens? They march out, they get ambushed, they get cut off, and the entire column, including Silvestre, is destroyed. They suffer about 10,000 killed, and basically all the gains they've made in 10 years are lost in a matter of a week.
That's unheard of in terms of like colonial wars.
I know. It's almost preposterous to kind of say it, like, without wanting to use 20th century terminology of like natives can't, beat us. But the Moroccan rebels destroy the Spanish army, kill about 10,000. I mean, that's killed as well, not casualties. I think Moroccan casualties are estimated at about 800.
Not even 1,000.
For 10,000 Spaniards killed. They obviously capture a whole load of not just territory but weapons and equipment, which is important for a guerrilla force. It's a total humiliation. And it kind of sums up the inadequacies of this system, this kind of governmental system, which is just failing in every respect. And obviously there's a question of responsibilities. Who is to blame? Such a terrible disaster can't go kind of without guilt, without someone being called to account. So the government puts together a special commission to investigate. And obviously, things don't move quickly in this system. It takes time. But there's a liberal government led by Garcia Prieto that comes to power in 1922. Once again, the Turno just keeps on turning. And they restore civilian control over. So they take away the army's jurisdiction over the colony. And they're going to publish the Commission's report. They also undermine the army by giving a pardon for a mutineer, a soldier who led a mutiny of soldiers who didn't want to get shipped over there, understandably. He's obviously sentenced to death by the army, by a court-martial, but the Liberal government gives him a pardon. So, as we've kind of seen before, the army defends its privileges pretty vigorously. And against this crumbling system, they don't feel intimidated at all. So, on the brink of this report being published, which will obviously condemn the army and possibly the king, the military stage a coup.
Right.
Which, unsurprisingly, is successful, and actually the Liberal ministers betray a certain degree of relief about being relieved of their responsibilities in government, to be honest. And that brings to an end the Turno system, this Canavite constitution. It's over in September of 1923. history's worst democracy.
I mean, it's amazing that they got away with it for that long to begin with.
That's, I think, the most incredible thing is it lasts so long.
Yeah.
Because it's such a flawed system.
Yeah. I mean, and
it almost has... Yeah.
It's compounded by all the factors that we talked about. And I mean, the region, the population disparity, the economy, the amount of control that these, local politicians have over their, constituents. Yeah. There's so many things upholding this. I mean, it's a delicate power balance, but it lasted for so long, and it was managed to stay balanced for very long. Not that that's a good thing necessarily, but it's...
Yeah, you're right. It's remarkable how long it survives.
Yeah,
really, it should have crumbled. You would have thought in 1917 or just after, or even before that. I guess the problem is that the opponents are just as divided, if you like.
They're so disorganized. I mean, you don't have any real amount of strength from, like, the socialists or anything like that.
Yeah, because the socialists are excluded from the system, they don't have any power. Because, Cambo and his Liga are the kind of most formidable opponents, perhaps, but then they just accept being brought into the system and paid off. The army, obviously, another formidable opponent, but they... again, just get paid off, and eventually when they decide the system isn't working for them, they just get rid of it. But yeah, it's a political system, it's a democracy that fails in every respect, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not representative, it's corrupt, it's economically pretty incompetent, it doesn't achieve social peace, really, particularly by the end.
It's essentially dictated by a king.
Yeah, a king and a group of elites. It's an oligarchy, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an oligarchy. Doesn't make any sense, but
and it kind of, I mean, you could say the system commits suicide because the Turno parties just disintegrate from kind of 1912 onwards. But nobody mourned its passing.
Yeah. So, what happens after this?
Well, the military coup I mentioned brings to power a guy called General Miguel Primo de Rivera, which is a great dictator name.
Yes.
And, well, he rules the country from 1923 to 1930. And, well, in some ways, he certainly, I suppose you could say it couldn't get any worse. In some ways, his rule does have some successes. And we're going to look at that in much more depth in our next episode, History's Most Benevolent Dictator.
Ah. Well, I'm looking forward to that. This is going to be really interesting to explore this the Spanish Civil War and the things preceding it, and of course also we should mention you've got your book coming out very soon.
Yes, very soon now. It's later this month. It's called The People's Army and the Spanish Civil War, and we're kind of building up to its release.
Yeah.
With this series, it's quite fun to be doing like a trilogy like this. Because we usually end the story and then it's kind of left at that. But we've got to the end of this story and we're going to tell you the next chapter and then the chapter after that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, so am I. It's going to be really, really interesting to dive deep into this because it goes on for so long and there's so many facets in it. And I mean, definitely so many facets as you've just heard from everything that just happened. But
things they get better and then they get worse.
Yeah. Oh, they get a lot worse.
But yes, we're really looking forward to bringing you our first kind of mini-series.
Yes. So, join us next time for history's most benevolent dictator. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Well, I've been Alex.
And I've been Peter.
And thank you for listening to History's Most.
Thank you.